Hey there, listeners. Today we prepare for our inevitable robot overlords, and we ask the question, if we can't fight them, should we tax them instead? And really, what do we mean by tax? For that matter, what do we mean by robot? This is Tech Policy Grind, a podcast from the Internet Law and Policy Foundry. I'm your host, Emory Roane, and today I talk to Nikolas Guggeneberger of the Yale Information Society Project about one proposal to deal with the apparently rapidly approaching wave of automation, taxing businesses that shift to a robotic workforce. Really, the issue is much more subtle than that. More so than I realized, at least, and I'm so glad to have gotten Nikolas on the show to break down exactly how much I didn't know. We also touch on some other ways technologies and government may be able to mitigate the upcoming robot jobacalypse, and Nikolas offers some sage advice for breaking into the tech law field, even when that means traveling to the other side of the world. I had an awesome time talking with Nikolas today, and I'm pretty sure you wonderful nerds out there will enjoy this too. If you do, or if you don't, I suppose, you can let us know on Twitter at Tech Policy Grind. Another big announcement, applications are still open for the next class of fellows at the Internet Law and Policy Foundry. I've had a few of you folks reach out already, but if you want to get involved with the Foundry, if you're an early career professional or student, I hope we see your application. You can apply at ilpfoundry.us/join, and applications will be open until April 30th. Again, that's ilpfoundry.us/join. Applications are open until April 30th. Do it. Foundry Fellows set the strategy and run the operations of the Foundry and do cool projects like this podcast. All right, announcements over. Let's get to the question at hand. Should we tax our robot overlords? So the last time this idea started making its way around the tech law and policy circles, I asked who I should talk to about the idea of sort of taxing businesses that implement automation as a way of dealing with the oncoming automation tidal wave that we are probably going to be dealing with sooner or later. And almost immediately, like within minutes, friend of the show, resident fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project and inaugural ILP Foundry fellow Tiffany Lee suggested we reach out to today's guest, Nikolas Guggeneberger. Nikolas is a postdoc at Yale Information Society Project, an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and somehow also an assistant professor at the University of Munster in Germany. Nikolas, thank you so much for joining us today.
For having me.
So I like to sort of softball this in here, as I do whenever I have guests on that are experts in fields that I know essentially nothing about outside of the general headlines. But this, I tried to probably do a rough explanation of the topic in the intro here. But we're talking about the idea that, if the robots are coming for our jobs, rather than fight the robots, maybe we should tax them. You have certainly been more plugged into that space than I have, and I was wondering if you could give sort of a background on the issue to our listeners about what we're talking about today.
I am happy to. So a couple years ago, this idea was floated by several people that we should start to tax robots. The rationale behind that being that robots will eventually take over many of our jobs. Alarming reports came out of half of the jobs more or less being subject to at least potential automation. And the reaction of people thinking about tech policy was to say, well, we can't really, maybe we shouldn't prohibit the use of robots as a type of innovation, but what we should do, we should tax robots. And for that, they gave various reasons. They said, well,
and it wasn't just anybody either, right? I mean, we're talking about some, this was Bill Gates, I think, was one of the people that was suggesting
this. We are
this.
talking about Bill Gates, especially, which is kind of funny because Bill Gates is one of the people who has certainly benefited from automation. And it's not just been Bill Gates. It's been discussed in the European Parliament, which eventually did not adopt a recommendation to tax robots, but it made it into a legislative body, and there were numerous economists. There were a couple tax policy experts that at least found that an idea interesting enough to further discuss it. So indeed, yes, this is not like one fringe thing. Famous people have suggested it, and legislative bodies have deliberated on it. As far as I'm aware, South Korea has even implemented as a measure that is close to what's been suggested by Bill Gates or deliberated in the European Parliament, which is to not directly tax robots, but to change the tax code in a way that makes it less favorable to enterprises to automate their businesses.
Yeah, as I'm trying to sort of wrap my head around the issue, that was something I sort of came up against as well, that in a lot of time, or in several of these proposals, it's less sort of, oh, you have a robot, this robot gets the robot tax, and it's more about, well, I think that the current tax system kind of incentivizes the replacement of meat sack organics with robots, right? And we're trying to shift that, or
it's absolutely
is that
correct. And I think it's very important to distinguish these two things, because one aspect, and the aspect that you alluded to, is more or less to say, through the current tax code, we are distorting the competition between human labor and automated labor, if you want. So we are incentivizing or subsidizing the automation to an extent that businesses might automate their business or replace human labor by robots, even where it is not economically efficient. They just do it because it's subsidized.
So how can, all right, this, now our listeners get to see just how clueless I am as soon as the economics of the issue gets brought in. But how could that, can you explain that a little more? I mean, if it is not economically efficient to replace, how can it not be economically efficient for them to replace them, but they're still doing it because of the tax code?
So let's assume I have a certain task to be performed, right? I can either either ask one of my employees to do that, or I can design and use a robot to do the very same task, if that is technologically possible. Both has costs to it. Now, if relying on human labor has a certain price, and if relying on a robot has a certain price, it might be the case that relying on the robot is, if you compare it directly, more expensive. But through the incentives in the tax code, through the possibility to take advantage of certain incentives for innovation, and at the same time, through the fact that I, for example, do not have to pay payroll taxes on whatever I spend on buying and then using that robot, it might be cheaper to use that robot instead of the human after taxes. So it's not cheaper to use to automate before taxes, but it is cheaper to do that after taking into consideration the taxes that you have to pay as an enterprise. And that's what I mean by I think we should distinguish between certain incentives in the present tax code that might distort the competition between human labor and robots to a certain extent, and the proposals that were put forward by people like Bill Gates, who wanted to go beyond that, who said it's not really about the nitty-gritty details of the tax code. It's more about that we have to go way beyond that we have to actively tax robots to either prevent automation to a certain degree, or at least to slow it down.
Oh, okay. So that was my misunderstanding. So Bill Gates was rather on the kind of the more I don't want to say extreme. What is another word for extreme?
Radical has a positive meaning. Radical can have a positive and negative connotation to it. But that said, I mean, Bill Gates, in the interviews that he gave on the subject matter, didn't go that deep into the details. As to rule out that he might have also referred to correcting certain misguided incentives in the tax code right now. But the way I understood him is that he sees a larger problem than the distorted competition.
Right. I see. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sort of connecting this in my mind because it's always going to be connected there, I think, by critics, but, to the Luddites smashing the looms, at the Industrial Revolution. And, I guess what you're saying is that there are reactions and there are reactions, right? And there are, we can try to shift the tax code to sort of try to, provide like a safety net or protections, or make sure that at least it's not overly incentivizing these Luddites losing their jobs to the looms. But on the other hand, there is some people that are just saying, well, at the end of the day, the Luddites are going to lose their jobs to these looms, and we need to make sure that there's an actual, job securing element there, not just the antitrust or tax issues, right?
I fully agree, and I think this is a brilliant segue into one of the most important questions around that issue that hasn't been really discussed is the very reason why we engage in that discussion. And there are multiple reasons and multiple potential reasons, I should say, but maybe just one of them is sort of convincing. There is one line of argumentation that suggests that we need to do that for fiscal reasons. Right? So the argument would be, well, if human labor is replaced by robots to a large extent, then our tax base is just eroded. And therefore, for fiscal reasons, we need to have a new source of income for the state, because otherwise the state doesn't have the means to fulfill whatever the state is meant to do. That reasoning I don't find fully convincing, because that doesn't necessarily suggest that we need to tax robots. We could simply tax capital instead, right? We could tax wealth. That doesn't the income of the state is not necessarily tied to labor as a source of taxation. Another reason that is brought forward, or that is suggested, is that we need to tax robots to fight inequality. And while I can see the appeal of that solution to fight inequality, I don't think that there is a direct reason, at least, to use or to solely rely on that measure. And that is, again, because we have other means of taxation. We can tax capital, we can tax wealth, and redistribute capital and redistribute wealth. And that can help fight the extreme levels of inequality that we are seeing and that we will be seeing, which leads me to the third reason that's brought forward, which I find more convincing. And that is, well, there might be something beyond labor as an income generating factor. And if we do see something with labor that goes beyond just the generation of income, and that is taken away from people, well, that might be a reason to think about whether we need to preserve labor for the availability of labor for everybody, if that has some sort of, either social function or just important, or is just an important element of people's lives, if that has a value beyond generating income.
Wow, that's really interesting. So I had never actually thought of that before. So I guess the idea of preserving jobs for job's sake is the idea that the act of having a job beyond simply providing one's income provides other sort of less tangible benefits that are worth preserving, if nothing else, because we don't know what will happen if we lose them.
That's what I personally find the most convincing argument in favor of a robot tax. I think if it's just a fiscal thing, or if it is just fighting inequality, then we don't. Well, I know, right? Of course, this just is meant in the literal sense of the word. That if that is the sole reason why we do it, and not to suggest that that is a small challenge to tackle at all. But if this were the sole reason, I think we have plenty of other measures that might have less wealth reducing impacts on the society in general than attacks on robots. And I mean, in this election season, we are seeing plenty of suggestions that are targeted towards directly fighting inequality, from higher marginal taxes on high incomes to a net wealth tax to other forms of redistribution.
All right. So let's say, though, assuming that we are interested in some form of a robot tax, or shifting the tax incentives, in your mind, how could we go about that in the most sort of prudent way possible?
That's actually a very interesting question. I think it starts with us having to define what a robot actually is. Because if we want to tax robots, then we need to be clear about what we want to tax. So while, at first glance, it seems very obvious what a robot is, that guy that we know from cartoons, or that character that we know from cartoons that acts like some sort of servant to humans. Well, but that's certainly not what's replacing jobs. Jobs are replaced by robots that don't look like robots as we know them from cartoons. They can be software. It might be some large server farm that runs some AI software, some AI algorithms on it. That could be the robot that we're talking about. So I think a major challenge, if we were to go down that route, that is not to say that I think it's the optimal route to pursue, but if we were interested, the first question we have to clarify is what we actually mean by robots. And at least as far as I am aware, none of the proposals that have gained traction do a very good job or a very sophisticated job in defining that.
I've got to say, I mean, I'd love to hear. Do you think that is a question that can have a satisfactory answer?
I think a positive definition of what a robot is very difficult. I think what you might be able to work with, and that's what's been suggested by a certain economist, is that to say what we're taxing is the replacement of work. So the argument would go, we're not that concerned with what a robot actually is, but we would tax companies if they replace workers. Now, that in itself is anything but easy, because like companies replace workers all the time, right? And they create new jobs all the time. So to figure out when a worker was actually replaced by something that we could define as a robot is in itself anything but easy, but maybe slightly easier because you have a comparison over time. You could say the company produced that much output with that many workers, and 2 years later they're producing the very same output but with a lot fewer workers, or a higher output with fewer workers. So you have a comparison over time.
What about for startups? What if you're a new company?
Yes, that's one of the problems. Well, being a new company in that sense is nothing but a synonym of innovation, right? So
exactly. I didn't want to use the I word. Now, all of our bingo listeners can cross out the center square. Innovation has been used for today's episode of Tech Policy Grind. I hope that you got a bingo.
Well, that is what I intended to allude to by using the I word is that the problem is not a problem that is only a problem to startups. It's a problem of these sorts of proposals across the entire economy. Because whether or not you're a startup, a change in how you do business has an effect on how productive you are. And a tax on robots, to a certain extent, is a tax on that sort of change. And that is true whether you're a startup that might increase its workforce, but by a factor of 10 or 100 increases its output, but is also true for a large company that might have a stable output, but is able to generate that output with fewer and fewer people. So I think the problem is the issue is the very same issue.
I'm trying to softball a way of segueing this into sort of your other areas of expertise, because I know that you've also written about sort of algorithmic governance, smart contracts, the automation of law more generally, and I'm wondering if those sort of other fields have any role to play, I guess, in this question of, if perhaps taxing robots is not the correct approach or is not the optimal approach. Is there, some solution or some recourse to be found in trying to maybe just improve the operations of government through other ways?
There might be a parallel between this debate about robots and other debates that relate to fairness and technology in general, and that is that whenever we focus on the technology, on the underlying technology that enables the change that's happening, I fear that we divert attention from societal problems and focus on that very technology. And that is a point that's very similar that I tried to make in the beginning about when I mentioned other ways to fight inequality or to generate income for the state. There are certain issues that derive from technological change, but oftentimes those issues cannot be solved by focusing on the technology, but can only be changed if we change our social structures. And in that sense, I think the discussion around the replacement of workers is very similar to discussions around algorithmic governance, but also on the automation of law in general, that yes, a certain technology brings change, but at the same time, the problems that we see are oftentimes not technological problems, cannot be fixed in a technological way or in a technology specific way, but the technology only shows us underlying problems with the structure of society, and that we have to counter those effects that we're seeing via structural or societal changes. That is maybe a parallel that I do see, or an overarching theme between these different aspects or issues that I've been working on.
So I guess I'd like to, before too long, sort of bring our conversation back around to the work you're doing at the multiple universities you are somehow all involved in simultaneously. But I also wanted to talk about the various interests that you have in algorithmic justice or algorithmic governance, and you've written about blockchain technology and smart contracts. Especially, I don't know how many listeners know that I certainly have a great interest in blockchain and smart contracts still, even despite feeling like the entire media and policy world has decided that it's a terrible technology that is never going to do anything. But I was wondering what it's like sort of still working on blockchain and smart contracts, and what that space is like right now, now that I guess some of the VC dollars are starting to dry up.
I guess my feelings are very similar to yours. I still think that there are many interesting possibilities, and I think I don't know how to call it, whether I want to call it crisis or winter or whatever you want to call that period, by and in large is due to an to the hype and the exaggeration that came before that. So all things are relative to a certain extent, and just as much as the hype during 2015, 16, and 17 was exaggerated, it might be too early or exaggerated in a way to say this cannot be used for anything. So I believe that there are certain use cases, and those use cases are certainly not we're going to fix the world and democratize and create liberty everywhere just by putting some registry on the blockchain. But there are certain use cases where this can increase efficiency, where this can enable new ways of payment, and where interesting research has occurred. So I think to that extent, my view of this sector is rather close to yours.
All right, so then let's start opining and talking about some of those ways, trying to bring it back to the discussion that we had at the outset around automation and responding to automation. What are some of the ideas that you have as far as how blockchain and smart contracts or speeding up or automating access to law could help dealing with that?
Well, I mean, that goes back to the very origins of smart contracts and to the more or less original ideas of blockchain technology, which was simply to create a means of exchange without a trusted third party. The classic vision of the online version of the vending machine. Now, the interesting aspect comes in when you're able to combine that with a high predictive capacity of what the potentially right outcome in a certain legal case is. So I'm definitely not one of the people who would ever suggest that in our lifetimes we could replace human reasoning by any sort of algorithmic reasoning entirely. But what we can do and what will be possible is we will have a pretty accurate idea what is most likely correct. Now, if we do have a pretty good idea what's most likely correct in a certain situation, and if we have a technology that allows us to more or less automate payments, there might be some potential in resolving potential legal disputes with a rather high probability that they're resolved in the right way. I can't do air quotes on a podcast, but just imagine me doing air quotes now. So this is where I really see the potential. Now, this, of course, in itself does not mean that we can get rid of courts or judges in any meaningful way. It just means that in more cases than now, we are able to produce an outcome that is either more likely to be compliant with the law or more likely to be in line with what the underlying legal contract stipulates. Now, just to clarify, in and of itself, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is good for society. It's only good for society if we at the same time are able to protect consumers, to protect users from overreaching enforcement of companies, corporations that try via expansive terms of services to make us comply with things that we either are not aware of or that are in themselves not compliant with the law. So I just want to clarify that I don't think that there is any automatism that leads us to more justice in the end. It is a potential that can be used in order to increase the general level of compliance, if you want.
So as I am poring over your LinkedIn page, as I do with all of our guests, of course, your description of your role as assistant professor in the University of Munster is a focus on IT law and especially blockchain, smart contracts, and the automation of law. I think that I've alluded to this or brought this up maybe 2 or 3 other times in the show already, but you are currently involved with not 1, not 2, but 3 different schools at the same time. So I'd love to sort of shift gears a little bit and talk about sort of professionally what that is like, how you are able to do that, and how lessons you might have for some of our listeners as far as whether you recommend that or I don't know. Just wanted to leave the floor for you for this.
Happy to. I don't know how far you want me to go back. So I got my primary legal education, meaning a JD equivalent in Germany at the University of Freiburg. I afterwards got a PhD in law, which is a thing in Germany for our US listeners. Also from the University of Freiburg, and did a 2-year clerkship there, clerked for a district court in Germany before going to the US to get a master's, an LLM, which is a sort of legal degree in the US, mainly attended by foreigners with an interest in US law. So I did that at Stanford Law School, returned to Europe afterwards, worked for the European Parliament for 2 years in the area of financial markets regulation and banking supervision. I then went back to Germany and took up a role as an assistant professor at the University of Münster, where I started to focus on IT law again, I have to say, because my PhD was already on network neutrality, or I wrote my PhD on network neutrality back when that was still cool and trendy and hip.
Hey, it's in 2019, net neutrality is hip again. There's net neutrality bills popping up all over the place.
It's back. It's hip. Now it's hipster.
Yeah. You can officially say I was into it before it was cool.
Okay. That's going to be my new line. And then from there, I took up this postdoctoral fellowship here at Yale, kept my affiliation with my German law school, and as of August of this year, I will become the executive director of the Information Society Project and give up my job in Germany.
So I'd like to ask you a couple of questions for our listeners as far as, a big portion of our show is advice for early career professionals trying to get essentially how they can take your job in 5 or 10 years from now. But the challenge of moving to another country or of trying to, create a position or establish yourself in another country, and especially in tech law field, it certainly is one that some of our listeners have had. So I guess first I'd like to talk about that sort of the challenges wrapped up in that jump across an ocean kind of move. But then also, and maybe you can answer this however you'd like, but the work that you're doing at the University of Munster, the stuff that we've been talking about today, this is not just sort of tech law. This is frontier tech law. This is areas of the law where there is absolutely no established right answer, and that in itself can be extremely exciting, but also intimidating and challenging, I think, for early career professionals to sort of navigate. So I'd love any advice you can have or sort of nuggets of wisdom you might have from trying to develop a position and carve your own reputation, your own career out in areas like blockchain and smart contract law and the automation of law, and also the challenges accompanying with sort of moving to the other side of the world.
Happy to. So maybe to start off with the question of how do you best move or transition to a different jurisdiction when you're trained in a field that's primarily designed to make you understand the legal system of one country. I think the best way to go about that is to understand that not as a burden, but as something that can help you, bring to the table, bring fresh thoughts to the table that other people who were socialized in that very system you're transitioning into might not think about because they don't have that outside perspective. They might not have challenged something that's been established in the field for many years. They might just live with it and try to build on it, but they might not be as willing to challenge the foundational assumptions. So I would try to see that as a chance and not only as a challenge. On top of that, I think especially in the area of technology regulation, tech law, if you want, you see an increased influence of jurisdictions outside the United States on the law in the United States. I mean, take the GDPR, right? In a sense, the GDPR has been incredibly successful. And I don't necessarily mean on substance. I mean, in terms of the PR it created for European law. I mean, if you had attended a conference in the US 5 years ago, there would have been very few people willing to talk about EU privacy regulation or EU regulation in general. Now, if you attend any given tech law conference, there's going to be one paper on the GDPR. I think this this effect that sometimes that's been called by others the Brussels effect doesn't only apply to the relationship between Europe and the United States, but applies to effects that jurisdictions all over the world have on the American legal system, simply by the fact of the fact that the economies and especially the digital world has become so interconnected. So I think there are two things that you can really turn into a chance and not only perceive as a challenge. Now I have to ask you about your second question. I kind of lost the thread there.
I think I might have lost the thread of asking it as well. But I guess I was talking about the, and I think that I think you actually kind of adroitly answered it, and that is that, when we're trying to carve out our own careers in these extremely developing spaces where, the laws, the technology is so new that there's no answer.
So that was that. So it's somewhat related. Again, I think that is a chance, not only and maybe not at all a challenge. Why is that a chance? So if you're writing something on a technology that is still evolving, there's not much that you can do wrong. There are not too many mistakes that people will blame you for afterwards. There's not that much literature that you have to go through to produce something that is of value. Now, let's look back at the early writings on the internet in the 1990s to about 2000 or so, when everybody was suggesting that the internet will in and of itself democratize the world, and free speech is no longer going to be a problem because free speech will become so ubiquitous. And if you look back at what's been written back then, 90% of it in hindsight was probably wrong. And yet, those people that wrote that back then, first of all, have made great careers. But second of all, I wouldn't necessarily blame them. They have tried to explain a new wave, a new development, new technologies at a time when they were not able to foresee all the developments. Right? They might. It's totally legitimate to miss certain potential threats or dangers simply because your horizon is limited while this while the technology is still evolving. So I don't think that is that it is a reason not to write or not to research this area simply because it is new. Again, I think it is more of a chance than a challenge.
I think that that's probably about the time that we have for today's show, so I want to thank Nikolas for joining us. We've got one more question that we have to ask each of our guests before they leave, and it's a recurring question we ask everyone that we can, and that is, Nikolas, is there any book that you're reading, anything on your bedside table that is keeping you up at night?
So recently I have read Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, which I can recommend to everyone. And presently I am reading Zucked by Roger McNamee. However, I have not gotten far enough as to tell you what's in the book. I will read it tonight, tomorrow, and maybe a couple days after.
All right. Well, we'll have to have you back on for an update. Nikolas, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
This has been an episode of Tech Policy Grind, a podcast from the Internet Law and Policy Foundry. We're a collection of early career professionals paving the way in the tech policy world, and we really hope you enjoyed the show. If you like what you just heard, it would be a huge help and mean a lot to us if you could head over to iTunes and leave a rating and a review. If you don't have iTunes, maybe just share the show with a friend. We want to thank Ali Sternberg for producing the intro and outro music for the show, and thank you all for listening. So, until next time, thanks.